No reincarnation equals no Gnosticism equals no Catharism. No reincarnation means no Gnosticism, and then of course no Catharism. Why? This is the reincarnation is a primary difference between present day Christianity and much of the great faiths. But it wasn't always like this. Just looking at reincarnation, if we go to the East, we have we go back to the Gitas and with Hinduism, and then there was 500 years or so before Christ, there was a breakaway with Buddha, who took the Hindu idea of reincarnation. Not all of Buddhism. I believe there's 3 major schools, and the 2 northern schools subscribe to reincarnation, rebirth, but not the southern school. And with Buddha, with the Buddhists, they took their teachings to China, and of course from China to Korea and Japan. And that's remained the East. So half the world's population has always gone along with the belief of rebirth, reincarnation, successive lives. If we go over to the West, with Egypt, that was a part of Egyptian religious life. And it's hard to find archaeological evidence of Moses and the Jews being enslaved in Egypt. Although there's Jewish records of it, there's no Egyptian records of it, and of course the Egyptians, they record everything in stone. Who knows, maybe the Jewish captives were such a minor incident to them that they never bothered recording it, but so far they haven't found any recordings in Egypt on stone. But anyway, the thing is that if people believe that the Jews did leave Egypt with Moses, and with that Gnostic thought travelled with the Jews. And of course not just that, the Hermetic beliefs of the Egyptians, as above, so below. And so then we have the Greeks, and with Greeks it goes back who knows when to the mystery schools, the Orphic schools, and certainly part of their mysteries was rebirth, and Pythagoras also subscribed to rebirth, and that would have come from the Greek mystery schools. Then after Pythagoras we had, because we had Plato, and Plato certainly promoted it and subscribed to it, Socrates of course. And I mean, Plato we owe so much to, but he also, one of his things that he promoted was virtue. Virtue amongst civilized beings, the Greeks and others. And he said, that if one honours virtue, virtue being goodness, then one will be rewarded with virtue. But if one slights virtue, then that slight will come back to you. So in some ways this is karma, cause and effect. And karma seems to go hand in hand, cause and effect, with reincarnation. If you live a good life, then, and you do have goodness in this life, then that will automatically follow you, hopefully in this life, but also in the next and the next. So we have this not only with reincarnation, karma, or cause and effect, or the aspects of karma, seems to be a fellow traveller alongside reincarnation. So it all culminated with early Christianity. Paul borrowed the Greek beliefs, the Hellenistic beliefs, and incorporated that into Christianity, because otherwise, Christ was a Jew, and if Paul just had Jewish beliefs, nothing was going to work, because this is like the Jewish wars, and when the Jews and the Romans are at each other's throat, and a pretty nasty war it was indeed. So here's Paul out to promote Christianity. So that's a little bit like during the Second World War, you're trying to promote the national religion of Japan, Shintoism, into America or Australia. It's just not going to work. So what he did was he actually brought in the Greek ideas, Greek philosophy, and incorporated that together with Christianity, and this made it more palatable to the Romans, because they looked to the Greeks for culture. So slowly Romans commenced to absorb his ideas of Christianity. Now, the early Christian fathers, you had Cyprian and Origen and Locantius, which is the son of St. Augustine. All these early church fathers, early Christianity promoted rebirth, reincarnation. Not all, but certainly probably the major church father at that time was Origen. But also, interestingly enough, they also had, I think Saint Cyprian was the first one, but church fathers said they had this Greek, it's extra ecclesiam salas nullus, which means there's no salvation outside the church. Which means today, and virtually every pope has promoted this, and St. Augustine, and it goes on and on and on, that without, unless you're a Catholic, there's no salvation. But in the early Christians, the thing is, they also believed in reincarnation. So if you didn't become a Catholic or Christian Catholic in this life, well then, okay, you've got the next life and the next life. So at some point in time, you had better become a Christian Catholic, otherwise you're not going to be saved. But of course, that's with the belief in reincarnation. But today, or since the 543, when Justinian, and 10 years after that, he had a couple of councils in Constantinople, and they got rid of all the beliefs to do with reincarnation. It was put outside the church, and it was, to think about that, was anathema, which means the belief in reincarnation is cursed. So for 1,000 years, until the 14th century, there was just no reincarnation, or the thought of reincarnation was completely lost as far as the Catholic Church, Christianity, was concerned. So therefore, when you take this extra ecclesiam salus nullus, that there's no salvation outside the church in that particular period, because you only got one life, and if you're not a Catholic in this life, then you're going to go to hell. But it was different in the early church, because you had this successive lives, and if you didn't become a Christian or a Catholic in this life, well then you've got the chance in the following life. But with one lifetime only, which they subscribe to these days, well then that's it. It's either you become a Catholic in this life or, sorry, it's damnation for eternity. And poor old Saint Francis Xavier, when he was leaving China, and he actually died on the voyage back, and he was, I believe he cried because he knew all these beautiful and wonderful Chinese people, but they're all pagans and they weren't Catholics, and so they're all going to go to hell. So he was really upset by this. And so as the story is told. Anyway, but what happened when the Emperor Justinian in Constantinople, and he got rid of the reincarnation, the scholars, and that's the time they also buried the Nag Hammadi, the Gnostic Gospels, which they found in 1954. It was at this time, because he just said, this is all, there's only the Orthodox works, and that's the only works we're going to keep. So a lot of the scholars then went to Alexandria, to the academy there, and that was commenced in by Antonius Salus Saccas in 193, and that became the centre of learning for everybody. And Jewish scholars went there, Islamic scholars went there, Christian scholars went there, pagan scholars went there. It was academy for everybody, and everybody argued, and this philosophy and arts and science all was in the academy at Alexandria. And this is when really new ideas and ideas were interchanged, and of course reincarnation was part of that. Part of the thought there, not necessarily with everybody. So Origen, Belicides, Locantius, son of Constantine, all these people went to the school at Alexandria. Plotinus he followed after Plato, and with the that school and academy in Alexandria was Neoplatonism. In other words, they took the teachings of Plato and they brought them to this academy. Now what happened, of course, when Justinian, he just said, okay, we're going to close all these things down, this is pagan teachings, and so it was then that the academy closed in Alexandria, actually by Justinian's decree, but anyway, at the same time that he closed these academies down, it was closed down there. So the scholars then went dispersed, they had their diaspora, and many went to Persia, all over the place. But the Jews, that was very much a part of their teachings at that time. And in fact, there was in England, and Oliver Cromwell in England, and he held one Jewish rabbi, a scholar, Manasseh ben Israel, and he held him in high regard. In such high regard, he allowed the Jews to come back into England, return to England, where they'd been expelled for something like 350 years from Edward I. And was Edward I a confessor? I don't know what he confessed to. I'm not sure what Edward that was, but anyway, it was Edward I, and he expelled the Jews. And it was Oliver Cromwell, because of the regard that he held this rabbi, Manasseh ben Israel, in such high regard, that he allowed the Jews to return to England. Now, that rabbi there, he stated in his writings that reincarnation was an integral part of the Jewish belief system. And so it went on. Of course, the Jews, wherever they went, and they had some hard times, so that they always had humour, the Jewish humour, which is quite unique in its own way, and it's always followed them. And a friend of mine, Michael, in Queensland now, and he took up smoking again. He's probably smoked himself to death. Mind you, the quicker you go, the quicker you come back. But anyway, he had this vast repository of Jewish jokes, and he had one for every occasion. And but what I remember was, it was typical, there's this loud knock at the door, and the door opened, and Mrs. Isaacson came in, and she said, Mrs. Abraham, she said, don't you know, don't you realise that your husband outside, he's been knocked down by a car and he's been killed? And Mrs. Abrahams was inside, and she's just drinking her soup, and she said, oh boy, she said, when I finish the soup, am I going to give a scream? And one more, the Jewish pessimist is talking to the Jewish optimist, and the Jewish pessimist said, well, he said one thing, he said, things can't get worse than what they are now. He said, it's impossible. He said, things just can't get worse than what they are. Things are terrible, really terrible. And the Jewish pessimist said, yes, they can. So it's got a real twist in its tail. So Jewish humour has also travelled with them wherever they went. And I believe with the Age of Enlightenment, the idea of reincarnation tended to give way to more towards science as far as Judaism is concerned. Could be corrected on that. So with the Catholic Church wiping out reincarnation and other sciences, so with the Renaissance, and especially Cosimo de' Medici, who was in Florence, and one of the great men of Florence, and he was interested in all forms of learning, art, music, and he was a patron of the sciences, of the arts, of music. And it was under him that they rediscovered the teachings and the beliefs of Egypt, reincarnation, and the Hermetic beliefs. And and of course, you know, we had the opposition with the Inquisition, because to do anything to do with science, we had with astronomy and Galileo. He recanted, and although there's been an apology for him, but the guy that stands out in my mind is Giordano Bruno. There's a station in Sydney called 2GB, and that's named from Giordano Bruno in the days of Theosophy. When, but he was tricked, and he came back, and he not only spoke of the stars, but he was the one, and he just said there's an infinity of universes beyond ours. So he was an amazing thinker, and so he debated with the Inquisition from his he was holed up in a cell for some 6 years. Excuse me. Anyway, they burned him to death in the Campo di Fiori in Florence. But on his way to the to be burnt, he was giving cheek and talking to the crowd as they took him through the streets. And to shut him up, the people guarding him, they put a spike through his cheek and his tongue, and one this way, and so that meant that he couldn't talk to anybody, and they burnt to death. And then with his ashes, they even swept up his ashes, so there was nothing left of Giordano Bruno for posterity. But he's the first person who refused to recant, who refused to bow down to the church, and he's regarded as the first person who's died for science, European science. A remarkable fellow. So, with that, reincarnation was reintroduced, or the idea of it was reintroduced into Europe. Today, in this age of information, all these avenues of thought, for and against pretty much any subject, is there. It's like a smorgasbord of information, a buffet table full of information that we can pick and choose from as we wish. But the big thing that separates us, when I say us, Gnosticism, Catharism, from the mainstream of Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and certainly the Catholic Church, is the fact of successive lives. So what happens in the next life is very much in accord with what we do and how we act in this life, which means cause and effect, karma. Continuously, one act, one thing, creating an effect on something else. And I was brought up a Catholic, and I went to confession, you committed some particular sin, whatever it was, and you confessed. And you had your penance, so many Our Fathers and Hail Marys and so forth, and it was gone, finished. That was the end of that. So things could be confessed through that mediator, the priest. But with karma, it doesn't work that way. Everything that one does that is good, that goodness will be repaid one way or another, not necessarily in the same way, but it will be repaid in this life, the next, the next, the next. There is no escape. Also, every piece of nastiness or things that are not very nice that we do, whether it be from stealing to murder to fraud or whatever it is, that can't be forgiven either. You can forgive yourself and understand, and you can repent, and good idea if you do. But that karma means that that must be repaid one way or another. Now, so but it's not repayment to punish you. It's repayment in such a way that you will understand that what you did wasn't a good thing. It wasn't the right thing to do. So it's karma from the point of view of enlightening you or teaching you that that's not the way to go about your business. But with karma, there's no escape. There's no priest giving you absolution, and bye-bye to that. It's recorded, and so goodness or lack of goodness or badness is recorded, and one way or another it's repaid, it comes back. So this is a major thing, and with reincarnation, karma and reincarnation also seems to be fellow travellers. So with reincarnation, it is one of the pillars, one of the main pillars of Gnosticism and obviously Catharism. There are many others, but without reincarnation, the idea of Gnosticism and Catharism would just fall by the wayside. I'm sorry if this talk sounded more like a history lesson, but it's certainly important points as far as Gnosticism and Catharism are concerned. So bye for now. Talk again.